Imagine planning for months to give your mother the perfect gift on her 60th birthday, only to watch her throw it in the trash without even looking at it. What she didn't know was that inside that box was the one thing she'd craved her whole life. And in rejecting me, she lost it forever. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today's story isn't just about birthdays or gifts, it's about betrayal, unmasking manipulation, and the sweetest revenge that comes not from anger, but from truth. Stick with me, because what starts with humiliation ends with liberation. The air inside the banquet hall was heavy with perfume, champagne, and unspoken judgment. Crystal chandeliers glistened overhead, reflecting fragments of light onto the silk dresses and polished shoes of the guests who gathered to celebrate my mother's 60th birthday. She had insisted on hosting it here, an extravagant venue with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. It wasn't enough for her to age, she had to age in style, with an audience applauding her every milestone. She stood at the center of the room, a queen surveying her court, dressed in a shimmering silver gown that hugged her still slim frame. Diamonds sparkled at her neck, as if to remind everyone of her worth. Her smile was sharp, too sharp. The kind of smile that demanded attention rather than invited it. My mother was not the type to grow old gracefully. She was the type to grow old demanding more, needing more, expecting more. Guests mingled around her, laughing politely, their eyes darting toward her every so often to make sure they were seen laughing. That was how it always was with her. People orbiting, careful not to drift too far lest they lose her approval. I stood quietly near the back, a glass of champagne in hand that I hadn't sipped from. My palms were damp despite the cool air conditioning. The black velvet box rested inside a gift bag at my feet, waiting. I kept staring at it, my pulse quickening. Months of preparation, endless late nights second-guessing myself, and yet here I was, moments away from either making her proud or watching her destroy me again.
Why do you look so nervous? A soft voice pulled me out of my thoughts. I turned to see my stepmother, Evelyn, standing a few feet away. She wore a modest navy dress, her auburn hair pinned back in a simple bun. No diamonds, no dramatic makeup, no need for anyone's gaze. She had always been the opposite of my mother, a presence that soothed rather than demanded. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a small smile. Her eyes lingered on me, gentle yet probing, as if she could see the storm inside me. But she didn't press. That was her way. She never asked for more than someone was ready to give. The master of ceremonies, a tall man in a tuxedo with a booming voice, tapped his glass for attention. The room hushed immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we are gathered tonight to honor a remarkable woman. 60 years of life, 60 years of brilliance, and countless memories she has given us all. Please raise your glasses for the incomparable Margaret." Applause thundered across the hall. My mother stepped forward, waving gracefully, her face beaming with satisfaction. She basked in the sound like it was oxygen, like without it, she might suffocate. Thank you," she said, her voice honeyed. "I can't tell you how much it means to see so many wonderful people gathered here to celebrate me. 60 years may sound like a lot, but I feel like I'm only just beginning." She paused, eyes glinting mischievously. "And of course, no celebration is complete without gifts." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew Margaret loved gifts. They weren't tokens of affection to her. They were proof of loyalty, admiration, and devotion. To give her something meant you understood her worth. To fail meant you didn't deserve her love. The line of gift givers formed quickly. Guests eager to present their carefully chosen offerings, jewelry boxes, designer handbags, bottles of aged wine, all paraded before her with exaggerated gratitude. She received them with smiles, with embraces, with theatrical gasps of delight. I waited, my stomach churned as the line dwindled, and soon it was my turn. "Ah, my child," she said, her eyes sweeping over me as though I were both expected and disappointing all at once. "What have you brought?" I bent down, retrieved the velvet box from its bag, and held it out to her. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound echoing in my ears. She didn't even hesitate. Her manicured fingers snatched the box, and without even pausing to admire the wrapping, she ripped it apart, paper tearing loudly in the otherwise quiet room. The sound was violent, like claws raking across fabric. Guests leaned closer, eager to witness her reaction. Her eyes narrowed when she saw the small black velvet box inside. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked at me, then at the crowd, her lip curling. "Is this a joke?" she said, her voice slicing through the air. Gasps and awkward chuckles spread across the room. I froze. She shoved the box back at me, then tossed it onto the gift table with a flick of her wrist, as though it were contaminated. "Really?" she said, addressing the room more than me. "After all these years, this is what I get?" Heat flushed my face. My throat tightened. "You're completely useless," she added, her tone cold, dismissive, final. The words hit harder than the champagne glass I gripped, harder than the stares pressing down on me from every direction. They weren't new words. I had heard them countless times as a child, but here, spoken in front of dozens of people, they burned deeper. The room buzzed with whispers. Some guests looked at me with pity, others with satisfaction, glad it wasn't them in the crosshairs of Margaret's cruelty. My mother smiled again, sipping her drink, as though she had just delivered entertainment. I glanced at the velvet box lying abandoned. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay still. Not yet, I thought. Not yet. From across the room, I caught Evelyn's gaze. She stood near the window, her expression somber, her eyes filled with something my mother had never given me, compassion. And in that moment, I realized that this night, this humiliation, wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning.
The moment the wrapping paper ripped, it felt like the whole room shifted. It wasn't just paper tearing, it was the sound of something fragile inside me breaking all over again. The bright red foil paper, carefully folded and taped, was shredded without a second thought, falling in jagged strips to the marble floor. My mother didn't open gifts gently. She never had. To her, the ritual of unwrapping wasn't about savoring thoughtfulness. It was about performance, a show of power. She had wanted grandeur. I knew it in the way she tore with expectation, eyes darting, ready to widen dramatically at a diamond bracelet, or perhaps the keys to the dream lighthouse she had been hinting at for months. Something that screamed excess, that screamed status, that screamed her. But when her tearing frenzy ended and all that remained was the small black velvet box, she froze. Her hand hovered over it as if it were an insult. Her perfectly arched brows furrowed. She didn't open it, didn't even flip the lid. Her gaze snapped to mine, sharp and dissecting. "Is this a joke?" The air in the room thickened. I felt the collective intake of breath from the guests, their curiosity hanging heavy, desperate to see how this would unfold. I swallowed hard, but my throat was dry. I wanted to speak, to explain, to tell her that this wasn't a joke, that what rested inside that box wasn't just a gift, but a piece of my father's legacy. But the words clung to the roof of my mouth, suffocating. Her lip curled as she shoved the box back at me, then let it drop carelessly onto the pile of discarded tissue paper and empty ribbons. The soft thud it made was swallowed by the silence, but it rang in my ears louder than the crystal glasses clinking on the tables. "Really?" she announced, turning her attention not to me, but to her audience. "After everything, this is what I get?" Laughter, nervous and uneven, rippled across the hall. Not the kind of laughter born from humor, but from discomfort. The kind people offer when they're desperate not to become the target themselves. "You're completely useless." There it was, the dagger, delivered with precision, with finality, with the sharpness of a truth she had always dangled in front of me. She wanted them to hear it. She wanted me to feel it. I stood there, rooted to the spot, a hollow space expanding in my chest. Her voice replayed in my mind, merging with every insult she had ever spat at me as a child. Every moment she'd reminded me that love was conditional, that I had to earn her approval, that failing to meet her expectations meant failing as a person. The whispers began almost immediately. I caught fragments. "Poor thing. She should have known better. I can't believe Margaret said that. She's always been demanding. I clenched my fists, not in anger, but in restraint. This was the exam I had been sitting for my entire life. And once again, I had failed. Or so she thought. From where I stood, I watched her smirk as she lifted her champagne glass to her lips, the picture of triumph. She believed she had humiliated me beyond repair, reduced me to rubble in front of everyone who mattered. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the real performance hadn't even begun. My eyes flicked to the velvet box lying on the floor beside the trash. My chest tightened. That box wasn't a failure. It wasn't an insult. It was the culmination of months of planning, of hours spent poring over legal documents, of my father's final gift to me, a deed, his handwriting, his legacy, and she had thrown it away without looking. Heat pricked behind my eyes, but I refused to cry. Not here, not in front of her. Tears would only feed her victory. Instead, I forced myself to breathe, to steady the storm inside me. This wasn't the time to reveal my hand. Timing was everything, my father used to say, and tonight, timing would be my greatest weapon. I bent slightly, retrieved the velvet box from where it had fallen, and cradled it in my palm. The guests watched, their eyes darting between me and my mother, unsure of what to make of the quiet dignity I tried to hold on to. Margaret didn't notice. She was too busy relishing her audience, basking in the discomfort she had orchestrated. She leaned back in her chair, her diamonds glinting in the light, the embodiment of a queen untouchable in her cruelty, but not untouchable forever. I turned, my gaze drifting toward the tall windows where Evelyn stood, her arms crossed lightly in front of her, her expression unreadable. She wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, just watching, a witness to everything. Her eyes, however, betrayed her heart. They shimmered with quiet sadness and something else, something like hope. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not yet. Not here, but soon. I tucked the velvet box securely into my jacket pocket and stepped away from the center of the room, letting the noise of the party swell again. Guests turned back to their conversations, though whispers followed me like shadows. My mother laughed too loudly at some meaningless comment, determined to recenter herself as the star of the night.
I learned early that birthdays in our house were not celebrations. They were examinations. Weeks beforehand, my mother would loft casual comments like bait into the air, a couture dress she'd seen in a window, a restaurant that had a 6-month wait list, a lighthouse on the coast featured in some glossy magazine. Absurd, theatrical things no one needed, but she convinced herself she deserved. She never said, "Buy me this." She said, "People who love me understand me," then watched to see who would scramble to prove comprehension. The morning of her big days, the house would glimmer like a stage. Candles, crystal, flowers arranged in odd numbers because even numbers are flat. And beneath all that glitter, I felt my ribs tighten, bracing for the grade. One year, when I was 9, I spent a month making her a paper bouquet. I drew lilies and peonies, colored them carefully, glued each to wire stems, and set them in a vase I'd painted sky blue. I loved the way the petals curled when the glue dried, like real flowers caught mid-breath. She lifted the bouquet, smiled toward the mirror rather than at me, then set it down behind the bread box as if it were a receipt no one needed. "Sweet," she said, the word landing like an apology for a stain. Later, I found the bouquet in the recycling bin, the wire stems poking through pulp and coffee grounds. That was the first time I felt the particular smallness reserved for children who misunderstand the rules of a game they never agreed to play. By 13, I'd learned the rules. Thoughtful equals expensive, she announced one afternoon, adjusting her earrings before a charity gala. The words were tossed lightly, but their weight hooked under my skin. I started saving allowance. I took on odd jobs, anything that could be exchanged for her temporary warmth. The more I brought, the more I earned access to a smile that felt like sunlight through glass. Pretty, cold, untouchable.
School taught me other numbers, fractions, decimals, the way a remainder trails after the solution like a quiet mistake. But home taught me valuation. People reveal themselves in what they give, my mother said. The pronoun was impersonal.
grammatical. The lesson was personal, surgical. On my 15th birthday, she gifted me a set of pearls and then asked me to take a picture wearing them for her social feed. The photo swallowed my face in glare. I looked like a figure posed to prove a point. "There," she said, tapping the screen. "You see? Love is visible." My father had a different definition. He was soft-spoken, careful with words, like a man who'd seen them used as weapons. When they divorced, he sat with me on the back steps under a sky that felt too big for the smallness I felt. "She will never be satisfied," he murmured, rubbing a callus with his thumb, "no matter what you do." He didn't say it to poison me against her. He said it like a weather report, a map of currents and storms. "Love isn't a scale," he added. "It's a landscape. You don't weigh a field. You walk it." After he remarried, weekends with him felt like stepping into a quieter season. His new wife, Evelyn, didn't orbit adoration. She grew it like window herbs. The first time I met her, she handed me a mug of cocoa, the color of roasted chestnuts, and asked if I wanted to choose the movie. Choose. I wasn't used to that word. In my mother's house, choose meant guess what I want. With Evelyn, it meant show me who you are. When I picked an animated film from when I was a kid, she laughed genuinely. "Perfect," she said, and she meant it. At my mother's, the living room was a museum. White sofa no one sat on, coffee table books no one read. A bowl of green apples replaced daily to maintain the illusion of perpetual arrival. If you brushed a cushion the wrong direction, a hand swooped in to smooth the offense. At my father's, the couch collected naps and stories. Blankets pooled like punctuation marks. On rainy afternoons, we drove to the lake and sat under the covered dock, listening to water drum the tin roof. He'd talk about small things, the way the light changed the color of the fish, the names of birds stalking the reeds, and the small things, clustered together, made a large feeling I didn't know how to name back then. Safety, maybe, or belonging that didn't demand a toll. Once, when I was 16, my mother asked me to help plan a fundraiser. It was the sort of event that made the society page. Men in navy suits, women in gowns that borrowed glitter from galaxies. I worked the registration table, typed donor names into spreadsheets, then stood at the door handing out place cards. "You're representing me," she said, smoothing a flyaway hair from my temple. "Smile like you mean it." Toward the end of the night, after speeches and auctions and a dessert so delicate it melted at a look, she introduced me to a jewelry designer. "This," she announced, "is the daughter I raised." A sentence had the weight of a reveal. I smiled on cue. Later, she told me I'd said lovely too many times. "It makes you sound simple." I swallowed the lesson like a dry pill and whispered to myself in the mirror that night, "Lovely, lovely, lovely," until the word lost sound and shape, until it became something I could put down. When Dad got sick, we didn't talk about the end. He pretended to be surprised by his breathlessness. I pretended not to notice the way his hands shook when he lifted a mug. On one of those lake days, late autumn, the water a sheet of hammered pewter, he brought a folder. "You'll keep this safe," he said, not a question. Inside was the deed to the lakehouse, his tidy signature underlined once, as if to say, "I mean this. For you," he said. Then, after a beat, "Give it to someone who values you." I turned the sentence over in my head the way I'd once turned stones at the shoreline, looking for flecks of mica. The instruction glinted and cut. "Okay," I said, and he nodded as if we'd agreed on the weather. We didn't talk about my mother, and the silence wasn't denial, it was mercy. He died in winter, when evenings arrive early and stay too long. The funeral was dignified, clipped, punctual. My mother wore black like a verdict. She cried precisely once into a linen handkerchief with a hand-stitched M. After the reception, she stood beside the coat-room door and whispered, "You should speak more slowly. You rush, and people think you're apologizing." Grief lodged in me like a splinter I couldn't tweeze out. At my father's house, Evelyn folded me into a hug that made my ribs ache with relief. We ate stew and biscuits, and watched the kind of television show that assumes you have a life richer than its plot. The next morning, she pressed a stack of note cards into my hand. "For thank yous.
But only if you feel like it. Only if. Another soft phrase I wasn't used to.
Years later, the lighthouse became one of my mother's favorite myths. It started as a line in a magazine about coastal property. White tower, clapboard keeper's cottage, fierce wind, then grew into a monologue delivered to anyone stuck beside her at a table. "I've always been a lighthouse person," she would say, as if lighthouse person were a species. She didn't want the sea. She wanted the idea of being seen from miles away, indispensable to someone else's navigation. She wanted to be the fixed point in other people's storms. The lake house never impressed her. It wasn't dramatic enough. Lakes are steady. Oceans perform. What impressed her were proofs. In high school, when I brought home straight A's, she congratulated the teachers at parent night and reminded me to maintain momentum. When I won a debate competition, she told real power doesn't argue, it arranges. When I got my first job, she asked about the salary first, then the title, then the health plan, in that order. Every success was a receipt. Every failure, a breach of contract. By the time I was 25, I could read a room faster than a menu. I could catalog desires, predict hunger, deliver applause in the language the recipient understood. I was very good at loving people who didn't love me back because I'd been trained to mistake performance for devotion. Evelyn's love didn't need receipts. She knitted uneven scarves and overwatered ferns and bought grape jelly instead of strawberry because it was cheaper that week, then laughed at herself for the stained toast. She didn't know how to cut mangoes properly and refused to learn because she liked the mess. "Let it drip," she'd say, flashing purple napkins like flags. With her, mistakes were just plot points. "We keep going," she'd shrug. On my birthdays, she baked lopsided cakes that leaned like exhausted dancers and sang too loud. When I apologized for not inviting more friends, she said, "The ones who matter don't need an invitation. The door just opens for them. The door just opens." Another sentence I hid under my tongue for later.
When the deed became more than paper, when it became a choice, I felt the old training flare. My mother had a milestone coming, 60. She had been preparing for it since 59. Implanting hints like seeds in every conversation. "A crown jewel," she joked with friends. And they laughed as though she were only joking. I considered the folder. Dad's underlined name, the lake framed by reeds in my memory. I heard him again. "Give it to someone who values you." The sentence had a lock and a key inside it. What if, I wondered, giving it to her made me visible at last? What if she saw the deed and through it saw me, the child who had held paper lilies like a bouquet of apologies, the teenager who smiled into the camera so her mother could post proof of love, the adult who learned to translate hunger into offerings? I am not proud of how long I considered it. Hope is a stubborn creature. It survives where logic can't. I pictured her opening the velvet box and gasping, not with performance, but with recognition. I pictured her taking my face in her hands and saying, "I see you." Even now, the phantom warmth of that imagined gesture flickers sometimes, like heat from a burned-down match. Then I pictured Evelyn at the window, rain stitching the pane, her palm resting lightly on the glass, as if she could touch the weather into kindness. She had never asked me for anything. She had never measured affection in invoices. She had once found my old paper bouquet in a drawer at my father's and set it in a jar by the sink. "These are marvelous," she'd said, tracing the curled edges like a botanist. "They look like they're listening." Listening. Another word for love, maybe. So I rehearsed the scene I eventually lived. The wrapping paper tearing like a verdict, the velvet box discarded, the air humming with 1,000 unasked questions. I planned the walk across the room, how slow I would go so the silence could deepen, how I would keep my face calm as a lake before wind. I planned for my mother's derision and for my own steady hands. I planned to give the deed where it would be seen for what it was, not a trophy, not leverage, but a promise fulfilled. And in the marriage of planning and memory, in the echo of my father's winter voice and Evelyn's summer touch, I found the thin, break edge of a new rule. Love is not earned, it is recognized. The past doesn't loosen its grip just because you name it. Even now, echoes return. Paper lilies in a bin, pearls glaring like moons, a hand sweeping a cushion smooth as if comfort were an offense. But the echoes have changed their weather. They don't drown me, they warn me of tides. And on the night of the party, when the red foil ripped and the room tilted towards spectacle, I felt those echoes behind me like a crowd that finally fell silent to let me speak. I would not argue with her. I would not audition for the part I'd always been cast in. I would open a different door, the kind that swings because the hinges are soft with use, and step through. My father never raised his voice, but when he spoke, the world seemed to hush around him. His warnings were not thunderclaps. They were weather forecasts delivered with quiet certainty. Growing up, I thought of them as background noise, the mutterings of a man too tired to fight. But as I stood in that banquet hall, watching my mother sip champagne after throwing away my gift, his words returned with the force of prophecy. She will never be satisfied, no matter what you do. The first time he said it, I was 11. My mother had returned from a charity luncheon fuming because a friend received a pearl necklace while she had been given only flowers. That evening, she slammed the vase into the sink, petals scattering across porcelain like discarded scraps. I tried to gather them, hoping to preserve something beautiful. My father touched my shoulder gently. "Don't bother," he whispered. "It's not the flowers she wanted. It never will be." His voice held no bitterness, just weary recognition. For years, I wanted to believe he was wrong. I wanted to think that if I worked harder, earned more, or bent myself into sharper shapes, she would soften. I studied her the way scientists study storms, cataloging the signs. The tightening jaw when disappointed, the arch of a brow when amused, the rare flicker of approval when she received something that satisfied her hunger for status. I convinced myself that love was hiding behind those signals, waiting for me to earn it. But my father knew better.
After the divorce, when weekends were split between two worlds, he repeated his warning in different ways. "Don't chase shadows," he'd say as we sat by the lake, fishing lines stretching into still water. "If you try to feed a fire with paper, it just burns hotter." Sometimes he spoke in metaphors, sometimes in silences, but the message was always the same. My mother's need was bottomless, and if I built my life trying to fill it, I would starve. When Evelyn entered his life, his tone softened. She carried warmth into rooms like a candle, and for the first time, I saw him rest. The tightness in his shoulders eased. His laughter came easier. One evening, as we grilled by the lake, he told me, "Love is not a scoreboard, son. It's a garden. You don't keep tally, you keep tending." He said it with a glance at Evelyn, who was humming softly as she sliced tomatoes. I remember thinking how alien the idea felt, that love could be steady, not transactional. The lake house became our sanctuary. Its wooden beams creaked in storms, its windows fogged in winter, and its dock groaned under our weight, but it was ours. On Sundays, we'd sit on the porch, coffee mugs in hand, watching the water shift from glass to ripples with the wind. He'd tell me stories about his own father, about mistakes he'd made, about the weight of regrets. If I could go back, he said once, staring into the horizon, I'd spend less time trying to win her approval and more time listening to myself. The day he handed me the deed is carved into my memory with painful precision. It was late autumn, the trees bleeding red and gold into the lake. We had just come back from stacking firewood when he pulled me aside, a folder in his hands. His face was thinner then, skin pale, but his eyes held their usual calm.
"This is yours," he said simply. Inside was the deed to the lake house, his signature underlined once. I stared at it, confused. "Why me?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He looked out at the lake, the wind tugging at his jacket, then said, "Because you need to know you have something that's not conditional, something that's yours because you are you." He pressed the folder into my hands. "But there's a condition. Don't give it away to someone who sees it as property. Give it to someone who sees it as you, someone who values you." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. At 17, I was still tangled in the belief that my mother's approval was worth chasing. Part of me thought maybe one day I could show her the deed, prove I wasn't useless after all. Maybe this was my ace, my chance to rewrite our story. When he passed, the folder became more than paper. It became a compass. His handwriting, steady, assured, was a reminder that at least one person in this world believed I was worthy without performance. But grief twisted everything. My mother's voice grew louder in his absence, filling the void with demands and criticisms. I found myself torn between his warnings and her expectations. like a ship caught between two currents. Evelyn never tried to compete. She let me grieve in silence, offering tea or simply sitting beside me as the fire crackled. Once, when I stared too long at the folder on my desk, she said quietly, "You don't have to rush to decide what to do with it. It will wait for you." Simple words, but they loosened something tight in my chest. For the first time, I realized I didn't have to let my mother dictate the meaning of my father's gift. Still, the temptation lingered. Every time my mother dismissed me, every time she rolled her eyes or cut me down in front of others, I thought about that box. What if presenting her the deed finally silenced her contempt? What if, for once, she looked at me with pride? It was a dangerous hope, but hope has teeth. It bites deep and refuses to let go. And so, when her 60th birthday approached, I found myself preparing. I chose a velvet box because it symbolized importance. I rehearsed handing it to her, imagined the gasp, the tears, the recognition I had chased all my life. Deep down, I knew my father's warnings. I knew the fire could not be fed, but the child in me still craved the impossible. What I didn't anticipate was how rejection could flip the script. She didn't even open the box. She tossed it away like trash, like I was trash. And in that brutal moment, my father's warnings crystallized into clarity. He hadn't just predicted her reaction, he had prepared me for it. He had armed me with the choice not to break. Standing in that hall, watching her sip champagne as if she had won, I realized his gift wasn't just the lake house. It was the freedom to decide where my worth went. And suddenly, the path forward was as clear as the lake on a windless day. The velvet box wasn't chosen by accident. I must have visited half a dozen stores before I found it, tucked away on a shelf in a small jewelry shop that smelled faintly of cedar and polish. It was simple, black, square, lined with satin on the inside. Nothing about it screamed luxury, but everything about it suggested importance. That was what I wanted, a container that carried weight, a vessel for something far more valuable than jewelry. When I first slid the lakehouse deed inside, it felt almost ceremonial, the crisp paper folded neatly, resting against the satin as though it belonged there. I ran my fingers over the lid, imagining how it would look in her hands. I imagined her opening it, expecting diamonds or gold, only to find something greater. Proof of legacy, permanence, and worth. Proof that I was not, as she often said, useless. For months, the box sat on my desk while I rehearsed the moment. I pictured myself handing it over, steady and confident. I pictured her eyebrows rising, her mouth falling open. I pictured the crowd gasping when she revealed what was inside. In my daydreams, she cried. Not the controlled tears she could summon for show, but real ones, the kind that blurred mascara and cracked her veneer. I imagined her reaching for me, pulling me into an embrace, whispering, "You finally made me proud." It was foolish. I know that now, but hope is seductive. It convinces you that the impossible is just one gesture away. Every time I doubted, I'd hear my father's voice, "Give it to someone who values you." The sentence turned over and over in my head like a coin, but instead of accepting its clarity, I twisted it into what I wanted to hear, that maybe she could value me if I just gave her the right thing. That maybe this was the moment she would finally see me, not as an extension of herself or a disappointment, but as her child. I even practiced what I would say. Alone in my room, I stood before the mirror, holding the box in both hands. "Happy birthday, Mom," I'd begin, voice calm but full of meaning. "This isn't just a gift, it's a promise. A legacy, something Dad left for me, and I want to give it to you because I believe in us." The speeches varied, but the heart of them remained the same, a plea for recognition. Meanwhile, my mother left no shortage of hints about what she actually wanted. At luncheons, she'd sigh dramatically over diamond bracelets worn by her friends. At dinners, she'd mention coastal properties with wistful exaggeration. Imagine celebrating my birthday at a lighthouse by the sea, she mused one night, her fork tapping the rim of her plate. Now that would be a crown jewel. The word crown stuck in my mind, echoing like a demand. But the deed felt bigger than any lighthouse, any bracelet, any show of extravagance. It was tangible proof of belonging. I clung to that belief, feeding it with every memory of my father, every moment he'd spent with me at the lakehouse. I remembered the creak of the dock under our feet, the smell of wood smoke in the winter, the quiet assurance in his voice when he said it would always be ours. Surely, I thought, even my mother couldn't ignore something so profound. On the morning of her 60th birthday, I polished the box until it gleamed. I dressed carefully, choosing a suit that wasn't too flashy but wasn't forgettable either. I wanted to look like someone who had thought carefully, someone worth noticing. As I slipped the box into a gift bag lined with tissue paper, I felt a strange calm wash over me. This was it. This was the moment years in the making. Yet, beneath the calm, doubt lingered. Evelyn noticed it when she saw me before the party. "Nervous?" she asked softly, tilting her head. "A little," I admitted. She gave me a look that was equal parts knowing and kind. "Whatever happens tonight, remember, it doesn't change who you are. Gifts don't prove worth. You already have it." I smiled, but I didn't believe her. Not then. My worth still felt tied to that box, to my mother's reaction. At the banquet hall, as the night unfolded and guests showered her with extravagant gifts, I held onto the bag like a lifeline. I told myself that mine would outshine them all, not because it sparkled, but because it meant something. And when it was finally my turn, when all eyes turned to me, I stepped forward with trembling hands and offered her the box I had so carefully prepared. The sound of ripping paper still echoes in my memory. It was violent, almost angry, as she tore through the wrapping without hesitation. She didn't savor the anticipation. She didn't pause to wonder. She wanted spectacle. And when the tearing ended, her disappointment was instantaneous. A velvet box, too small, too simple, too silent. She didn't open it. She didn't even give it a chance. Her judgment was swift, merciless. She tossed it aside as though I had handed her a stone wrapped in ribbon. "Is this a joke?" she sneered, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. In that moment, months of preparation collapsed into ash. The words I had practiced, the tears I had imagined, the embrace I had hoped for, all vanished. She had rejected not just the gift, but me. And yet, as crushing as it felt, something unexpected stirred beneath the humiliation. A spark of clarity. For the first time, I saw the truth without distortion. She would never open the box. Not just the velvet one, but the metaphorical box I had spent my whole life offering. My achievements, my devotion, my desperate bids for approval. She would always toss it aside. The velvet box wasn't wasted, though. Not yet. I picked it up, my hands steady despite the whispers around me. If she didn't want it, if she couldn't value it, then maybe, just maybe, someone else could. Someone who already had. As my mother basked in her hollow victory, sipping champagne with a smirk, my eyes drifted to Evelyn, standing quietly by the window. And in that instant, the velvet box changed meaning. It was no longer a plea for love. It was a gift of recognition, a choice, a turning point, and I knew exactly what to do next.
The thing about humiliation is that it rarely stays private. It spreads, seeping into corners, carried on whispers and glances. The moment my mother flung the velvet box aside, it was as though the air in the banquet hall shifted temperature. Laughter died mid-breath, conversations halted mid-sentence, and all that remained was the echo of her words. "You're completely useless." The guests didn't look at her, they looked at me. Their eyes darted in my direction, some filled with pity, others with discomfort, a few with thinly veiled amusement. Watching someone else get cut down had a strange allure, like a car crash unfolding in slow motion. Safe as long as it wasn't them, people indulged in the spectacle. I could feel their whispers brushing against my skin. "Did you hear what she said? She's always been like this. Imagine saying that to your own child."
And then the other voices, the ones not meant for me but loud enough anyway. Well, maybe they should have known better. You don't give Margaret something small. Black velvet box? What was she thinking? My face burned, my pulse thundering in my ears. For years, I had feared this very moment. Public disgrace orchestrated by the woman who knew exactly how to wield it. And she looked so smug, sipping her champagne, satisfied at having made me the evening's entertainment. To her, the gift wasn't an offering, it was an audition. And in her eyes, I had failed spectacularly. But there was something she didn't expect.
Humiliation has two outcomes. It can break you or it can free you. As the whispers multiplied, I bent down, retrieved the discarded velvet box, and held it against my chest. My movements were deliberate, measured, and the room noticed. Silence swelled in pockets, spreading like ripples in a pond. People leaned forward, curious. They had seen the rejection. Now they wondered what I would do next. My mother noticed too, though she pretended not to. She threw her head back and laughed at some meaningless comment from a guest, her voice pitched higher than usual, but her eyes, sharp, darting, never left me. She wanted me to crumble, to retreat into myself, to leave the box where it lay so her narrative could remain unchallenged. But I didn't. I stood tall, the velvet box in hand, and began walking, not toward her, but away. Gasps fluttered across the hall. It was subtle, but the choice was unmistakable. I was rejecting her rejection. As I walked across the polished floor, my shoes clicking in rhythm, I felt the weight of every eye following me. Some guests whispered to each other, their voices urgent. Others froze, afraid to miss whatever came next. The spectacle had turned, and for the first time that evening, I wasn't the victim. I was the suspense. I passed table after table, catching fragments of expressions. A woman in a red dress raised her hand to her lips, eyes wide. A man in a gray suit leaned closer to his companion, muttering something I couldn't hear. Near the back, someone stifled a laugh. Not mockery, but astonishment. And then I saw her. Evelyn, standing near the window, her posture composed, her expression calm, but curious. She hadn't laughed at my humiliation. She hadn't looked away in pity. She had simply watched, quiet and steady, as though she knew this moment would come.
I tightened my grip on the velvet box. My mother's voice echoed in my head, useless, worthless, failure. But beneath it, stronger now, was my father's. Give it to someone who values you. The whispers behind me grew louder. My mother's smirk faltered. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne glass, the diamonds at her throat glittering under the chandeliers as she leaned forward ever so slightly. She thought I was making a scene. She thought I was trying to embarrass her in retaliation. She didn't understand that this wasn't about her anymore. When I reached Evelyn, I stopped. The crowd hushed. The velvet box felt heavier than ever, a symbol of years of desperation, rejection, and hope. My hand trembled slightly as I extended it toward her. For you, I said simply. Her eyes widened, shimmering in the light. For a moment, she didn't move. The silence grew unbearable, stretching thin like glass about to shatter. And then, slowly, she reached out and took the box. Her fingers brushed mine, warm and steady. The room collectively exhaled. Unlike my mother, Evelyn didn't hesitate. She lifted the lid carefully, reverently, as though the contents deserved respect no matter what they were. When her eyes fell on the deed inside, her hand shot to her mouth. Her shoulders trembled, tears pooled, catching the chandelier's light. You can't mean, she whispered, her voice breaking. I do, I replied softly. The room froze. Conversations died. The atmosphere shifted from mockery to awe. Guests craned their necks, desperate to see what had left her so moved. My mother's laughter faltered, died, then disappeared entirely. What is that? She demanded, her voice sharp, cutting through the hush. Evelyn looked at me as though asking permission. I gave a small nod, and with trembling hands, she lifted the papers high enough for the closest guests to see. Gasps erupted. Murmurs rippled through the hall. It's the lakehouse, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. The deed. Signed. Sealed. His handwriting. The color drained from my mother's face. Her jaw slackened. Her eyes darted between me, Evelyn, and the papers. The lake house? She repeated, her voice cracking. That was mine. That was supposed to be mine. I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. No, it was mine. And now it belongs to the one person who never asked, never demanded, and never made me feel worthless. Gasps. A collective murmur rippled like a wave through the hall. Guests leaned closer, whispering fiercely, their expressions shifting from discomfort to disbelief to fascination. My mother's facade, once untouchable, began to crumble before her own audience. She lunged forward, desperation breaking through her practiced elegance. "You can't do this to me," she cried. "You owe me." I stepped closer, leaned in just enough so only she could hear. No, I owed Dad, and I just honored him. Her grip on control slipped. Her hand shook, her face contorted, and for the first time she looked small. Not regal, not commanding, but fragile in her own hunger. The crowd saw it too. Her empire of control was collapsing in real time, and I, once the victim of her humiliation, was the one who had set it in motion.
If my mother was a cathedral of marble, cold, echoing, and built for strangers to admire, then Evelyn was a kitchen with the oven on and the light above the sink left burning for you. Standing there with the deed trembling in her hands, she looked less like a woman receiving property and more like someone entrusted with a living thing. Her eyes were wet, her breath unsteady, but her spine was straight. She didn't reach for theatrics or try to gather sympathy from the room. She simply held the pages like a promise and looked at me the way people look at a horizon they thought they'd never reach. "Are you sure?" she whispered, so soft I almost missed it beneath the crystals chiming from the chandelier's draft. "Yes," I said, "I'm sure." For a heartbeat, the hall forgot itself. The gossip, the performance, the currency of reputation, all of it stilled, as if the party had slipped off its rails and rolled into a quieter world. In that hush, I felt my father's presence, not as an ache, but as a hand at my back. The deed was his handwriting, but the choice was mine, and the choice, finally, felt like me. Evelyn pulled the papers to her chest and closed her eyes. Not for effect, not to display emotion, but to absorb it. When she opened them again, she had that particular expression I'd come to recognize in her. The one that said, "I will take care of this because I know how to take care of things that matter." My mother broke the spell with a brittle laugh. "This is ridiculous," she said to the room, the word spraying sparks. You can't give my lake house to someone else." "It was never yours," I said, not cruelly, just cleanly. "And it isn't mine anymore either." A man near the back coughed to hide an involuntary wow. Somewhere a champagne flute chimed against a plate by accident. A woman in a sequined dress said "good for them" under her breath. And I watched the sentence move from person to person like a lantern passed down a line. Evelyn didn't gloat. She didn't look for eyes to validate her or reach for an audience the way my mother always did. She simply set the deed back into the velvet box, closed the lid gently, and held it with both hands as though keeping it warm. "Thank you," she said. And the two words landed with more gravity than any speech could have, for trusting me with him and with this. She darted a glance toward the windows, toward the lake, darkening into night beyond the glass. He would want it to keep making shelter. Shelter. I tasted the word. My mother's gifts had always been towers and lighthouses, structures you look at. My father's gift was a house, a place you live in. It took only minutes for the party to reorganize itself. Guests avoided my mother's orbit the way one backs away from a candle that has burned down to the wick and begun spitting black smoke. A few approached me with murmured congratulations disguised as neutrals. "What a beautiful gesture. Your father would be proud." And then with a speed that surprised even me, they drifted to Evelyn. They weren't there to praise her exactly. They were there to anchor themselves to whatever steadiness she radiated. She shook each hand like it was the first one she had shaken that night. "Yes, it's a special place," she said, when a man asked about the house. "He learned to skip stones on that dock," she told a woman who remembered my father's laugh. When someone asked, "Will you renovate it?" she smiled small. "Repair, maybe, but not erase." Evelyn attempted to retake the room with a toast. She clinked her glass. "To," she began, but her voice snagged on the air and nowhere near enough people lifted their flutes. The master of ceremonies, sensing a scene he couldn't polish,
announced the dessert course instead. Silver lids lifted, vanilla and sugar wafted. The crowd's attention flowed away from her like a tide that had decided on a different moon. Evelyn slipped beside me, still holding the velvet box. Up close, I could see the fine tremor in her hands, the aftershock of grace. She nudged my shoulder with hers, the gentlest acknowledgement of the storm we had crossed. "You're steady," she said softly. "I don't feel steady," I admitted. "That's what makes it real," she replied. "Balance isn't the absence of shaking. It's the choice you make not to sit down." We stood together, companionably quiet, as people pretended to enjoy their pavlovas, and no one quite met my mother's eyes. I thought of all the birthdays behind us, the paper lilies in the trash, the pearls glaring in photographs, the running tally of what counted and what didn't, and realized that for the first time, a birthday had delivered something like truth. "May I ask you something?" Evelyn said. "Anything." "Why me?" She wasn't fishing, she was careful. "Why not keep it? It was yours." "Because I wanted you to have somewhere to put your kindness," I didn't say. "Because you taught me the difference between being seen and being displayed. Because on days when grief gnawed the edges of me, you handed me a mug and said, 'Let it cool in your hands first,' as if warmth could be saved for later. Because you never measured love in receipts." Instead, I told her the sentence my father had left me. He said, "Give it to someone who values me." I let the pronouns stand where they fell.
Evelyn's eyes filled again, but she didn't blink them back as apology or weapon. She let them be. "Then I accepted on those terms," she said, "and I'll keep them intact." Across the room, my mother sat very still, a statue of a woman titled "Elegance Interrupt Us." Her friends, weary orbiters, performed sympathy in miniature doses, their looks sharp with calculation. If she had been capable of gentleness, if she had been able to stand and say, "I was wrong, this is beautiful," the party might have tilted back toward her. But repentance requires the admission that you can't control everything, and control was the last thing she had left. "Do you want to leave?" Evelyn asked, as if we were deciding to step out of a movie whose third act had fallen apart. I looked at the lake beyond the windows, blue-black and honest. "Soon," I said. "There's one more thing I want to do." We moved through the room together, not hiding and not grandstanding. People made space the way crowds do for a patient being wheeled down a corridor, deference without understanding. I paused beside my mother's table. She lifted her chin a fraction of an inch, trying to hold an angle that photographs well. "Congratulations?" she said, and the word sounded like a piece of dry toast you try to swallow without water. That would be the right word if this were about winning. I kept my voice low, even, a tone I learned from my father. "It isn't. It's about putting things where they belong." She laughed once, a sound like a snapped stick. "You think you're noble." "I think I'm finished," I said. Not cruel, clean. For the first time since I'd handed her the gift bag, she actually looked at me. Not through me or around me or at the reflection of me in some imagined audience, but at me. I saw the flash of a child who had once learned that attention is the scarcest currency, the first thing you hoard when the world feels thin. It flickered and died. "You'll regret this," she said, a prophecy emptied of power when spoken from a throne that had already been dismantled. "Maybe," I said, "but I'll regret not choosing myself more." Evelyn squeezed my elbow, not to steer me away, but to remind me there was something to walk toward. We left my mother with her immaculate dessert trembling on the plate, as if even the molded sugar had learned uncertainty.
Near the windows, I pressed my palm to the glass, the same gesture I'd seen Evelyn make 100 rainy afternoons. The lake was moonless and loyal, a sheet of dark patience. I imagined the dock, the way its planks answered footsteps with groans that weren't complaints so much as conversation. I pictured the porch light, throwing a small coin of gold onto the threshold, the kind of light that says, "You're late, but you're home." "I'll drive out tomorrow," Evelyn said. "Turn on the water, open the windows, see what the house remembers." "It remembers everything," I said. "The summers, the winters, the way he cut wood too neatly because he said even logs deserve respect." She smiled at that, the sort of smile you pack in your pocket for later. "Then we'll let it keep remembering." We didn't slip away. We said goodnight the way polite people do, accepted the awkward half-hugs of guests who were suddenly very interested in being seen with us, and thanked the staff for the work none of the guests would recall tomorrow. The master of ceremonies, relieved to have a shape to the evening again, shook my hand as if I'd rescued him from a script with a bad ending. At the door,
The night air kissed the heat from our faces. Cars idled, drivers checking their mirrors. The kind of choreography that happens every evening in cities that think they are unique. I inhaled deeply. The scent was simple. Asphalt, damp foliage, the faint mineral promise of the lake. "Come with me tomorrow?" Evelyn asked. I could use help finding which window sticks in the back bedroom. "I'll bring graphite," I said, and she laughed, because of course I would. Before we parted, she handed me the velvet box. I startled. "You should keep it." "I will," she said, "at the house, where it belongs. But you're the one who returns things to their place." She nodded toward my pocket. "And you might need it tonight to remember what you did was not a trick, not a spectacle. It was a correction." I slid the box into my jacket. It fit there as if tailored for it. "Get some sleep," she added. "You'll feel the shake in your legs when you're alone. That doesn't mean you were weak. It means you were heavy and put it down." We hugged for the first time that night, the first time that felt like an answer. She left in a sedan that's seen enough honest miles to make the engine's sigh feel like relief. I watched the taillights swim red across the drive and fade. Behind me, the party resumed in its smaller, noisier way. Laughter returned, thinner. Music tried to cover the seams. Somewhere inside, my mother would be rewriting the story for herself. How she chose to let the house go. How the gesture reflected her grand generosity. How the evening had been about love all along. I didn't need to hear it. I didn't need to correct it. The lake corrects everything in time, sanding hard edges into shapes that lie easily in the palm. I stood another moment under the dark's honest weight and imagined tomorrow. The smell of dust waking when windows lift, Evelyn's hands on the shutoff valve, my father's mug still in the cabinet we never reorganized, because even grief understood not to move it. The house would exhale. And so would I. When I finally walked to my car, the velvet box thumped lightly against my ribs with each step, not like a burden, but like a heartbeat matching my own. The morning after the party, the whispers hadn't stopped. They had only multiplied. I knew because within hours, my phone began buzzing with messages, some from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, others from numbers I didn't even recognize. "Is it true?" one message asked. "Did you really give Evelyn the lake house?" another read. Someone even sent a shaky video clip from the party, already making its way through the invisible channels of gossip that move faster than news. My mother's voice, sharp, furious, echoed in the recording. "That was mine! That was supposed to be mine!" And beneath her voice, mine. Calm, steady, undeniable. No, it was mine. And I gave it to the one person who never asked for it. By noon, it wasn't just whispers. It was a story, a scandal, an inversion of the script my mother had carefully written for decades. For years, she had painted herself as the center of gravity, the woman everyone envied. Her parties weren't just social gatherings, they were performances. Each gift and compliment another jewel in her crown. But now the crown had slipped and the whole room had seen it. That afternoon, I drove to the lake house with Evelyn. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, the road winding like a ribbon through the woods until the water appeared, a wide stretch of blue-gray shimmering under the autumn sun. My chest tightened as memories rose, my father's laughter echoing off the dock, the sound of rain against the tin roof, the way he always called it our place, even when it was only his name on the deed. We parked in the gravel drive. Evelyn stepped out first, her eyes sweeping across the weathered boards, the peeling paint, the windows clouded with dust. She exhaled like someone stepping into a dream they weren't sure they deserved. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's old," I said. "Beautiful things usually are," she replied. We unlocked the door together, the hinges groaning like they were waking from a long sleep. Inside, everything was exactly as I remembered. The faint smell of cedar, the crooked picture frames, the mug with my father's initials still sitting on the kitchen counter. Dust danced in the shafts of light that filtered through the curtains, but nothing felt abandoned. It felt paused. Evelyn ran her hand over the counter, the back of a chair, the worn sofa that had absorbed 1,000 conversations. She wasn't inspecting, she was remembering. Even in spaces she hadn't built, she carried a gift for memory. I set the velvet box on the dining table. It looked small there, almost fragile, but its presence changed the air. We both sat, the weight of what had happened still heavy between us. "You know this isn't just about property," I said. "I know," she replied. "It's about him, about everything he stood for, and about her." Evelyn nodded slowly. She wanted it because it represented permanence. To her, permanence means ownership. To him, permanence meant belonging. I stared at the box. "She'll come after it, you know. She'll fight." "Let her," she said softly. "She'll lose. Not because of the law, because of truth." She already lost last night. Her words settled into me like stones finding their place in water. That evening, as the sun set over the lake, we sat on the porch with mugs of tea. The water shimmered gold, then silver, then black as night took hold. For the first time in years, I felt stillness. Not the brittle silence of my mother's house, but the living quiet of a place that breathes with you. And then my phone rang. My mother. I didn't answer. The next morning, she arrived in person. I heard her car before I saw it. The growl of expensive tires on gravel, the slam of a door, the sharp click of heels against the path. Evelyn and I were on the porch when she appeared, dressed in a tailored coat, her face painted into composure, but her eyes wild. "That's mine," she said without greeting, pointing toward the house as if it had betrayed her by existing. "No," I replied, standing. "It never was." She stormed closer, her voice breaking. "He promised me. He told me." "No," I cut in, my tone steady. "He told me. He gave it to me, and I gave it to someone who values me. That was his condition, not yours." Her breath hitched, fury warring with desperation. She looked at Evelyn, sitting calmly in her chair, the velvet box resting in her lap. "You don't deserve it," my mother spat. Evelyn didn't flinch. "I didn't ask for it, but I'll honor it." The words landed like a gavel. For a long moment, my mother just stood there, trembling. Then she did something I'd never seen before. She faltered. Her shoulders slumped, her voice cracked. "You don't understand. Everything I've done, it was so people wouldn't forget me." I almost pitied her. Almost. But pity is not the same as forgiveness. "You were never forgotten," I said softly. "But you chose to be feared instead of loved, admired instead of remembered. That was your choice." Her eyes glossed with tears, but they weren't for me. They were for herself, for the empire she'd built on sand, now crumbling. She turned sharply, heels digging into the gravel, and left without another word. The lake was quiet again. Evelyn reached over, her hand warm on mine. "It's over," she murmured. I shook my head. "No, it's beginning." And as I looked out at the water, I knew she was right. The revelation wasn't that my mother had lost the lake house. The revelation was that I no longer needed her to lose for me to win. Reputations don't fall like trees. They unravel like sweaters. One loose thread, tugged by the right hand, and what once seemed seamless becomes a soft, silent mess at your feet. In the days after the party, my mother's empire of control didn't crash. It frayed. The first tug came from the video. 32 seconds of her voice slicing the air, of me retrieving the velvet box, and Evelyn's hands trembling around the deed. 32 seconds that slipped from phone to phone with the efficiency of weather. At first, she tried to smother it. She called acquaintances and demanded context be added. She told her closest friends, women with hard blazers and harder smiles, that she'd allowed the property to go to the caretaker branch of the family out of magnanimity. It was always about honoring his second marriage, she said, as if revision could substitute for truth. But the footage didn't tear for captions. People trust what they see, and what they saw was not benevolence. It was refusal, derision, and a gift discarded. The charity board was next. For years, my mother chaired galas like a general, assigning tables like battle positions, deciding whose pledges deserved applause and whose required follow-up. The board had tolerated her sharpness because she could fundraise. Success by silence in polite circles. But now, donors forwarded the clip with uneasy subject lines. "Have you seen?" And committee members began suggesting fresh leadership optics. Optics, a word that can turn royalty into a liability. By the end of the week, the board gratefully accepted her resignation and praised her years of service. The sentence read like a tombstone. Vendors who once bent their schedules around her suddenly discovered conflicts. The florist who imported peonies in January now apologized. Supply chain is unpredictable. The maitre d' who always found that extra table near the window emailed, "We're fully committed." A boutique sent her the wrong size and didn't scramble to correct it. Small refusals, braided together, form a rope you can't pull. Her social circle, less a circle than a carousel, kept turning, but fewer hands reached to help her on. People who'd once asked for her favor now asked for none of her trouble. Invitations arrived with an asterisk. Intimate,
replaced grand, and somehow she was always on the wrong side of the adjective. She went, of course. She always went. But the seating shifted. She found herself nearer the kitchen doors than the toasts, conversations closing politely around her like umbrellas. She smiled harder. Her laugh sharpened. She developed a new habit of rearranging cutlery, as if spoons could be made to align into allegiance. In that same span, the lakehouse opened. Eaves were brushed, gutters cleared, windows unstuck with graphite. Evelyn and I worked without ceremony, our sleeves dusted white, our knees scuffed, our pockets full of screws that didn't match anything but still felt worth keeping. We aired quilts in a wind that smelled like pine and old rain. We found my father's toolbox where it had always been, hammer handle worn to the shape of his hand, measuring tape that snapped back with offended dignity. We didn't renovate, we mended. The house rewarded us with small mercies. A door that stopped complaining, a faucet that remembered restraint, a porch light that flicked on like a nod. Neighbors drifted over with casseroles and practical rumors. We were worried it would be sold to developers, one said, pointing across the water where new roofs gleamed like teeth. Glad it stayed a home. Another shared a folded photograph of my father holding a stringer of fish, grin cocked at an angle that could make you forgive a bad joke. People remembered him in details, how he called thunderstorms drum practice, how he returned rakes sharper than when he borrowed them. Their memories stitched him back into the place so cleanly that grief felt like a seam you could rub and not reopen. My mother texted me nightly. At first, demands. Return the deed. Meet me with my attorney. When I didn't respond, the texts became performances without an audience. I am disappointed in your behavior. You are being manipulated. Then they softened into guilt sing-song. After all I've done for you, a mother sacrifices so much. When that failed, she tried prophecy. You'll see the consequences. When that too dissolved, a final pivot. Pleading. Can we talk? I'm lonely. The words should have pierced. They only grazed. Truth had thinned the armor of obligation. The blows no longer landed. I did call once, not because the messages moved me, but because the silence in between had started to feel like I was narrating her out of existence. She answered on the first ring, breath poised like a diver. So, she said, the words stretched, a tightrope. I won't argue, I told her. There's nothing to argue. You've humiliated me. Publicly. In my own house. Her tone put the emphasis on my, as if possession were grammar you could enforce.
You humiliated yourself, I said. And because it was true, it didn't require volume. You threw away a gift you hadn't opened. And you didn't open it because the container didn't flatter you enough. Silence, then a sound I couldn't sort. Anger or the vocal version of reaching for a chair that isn't there. I made you, she said finally. Don't forget that. You assembled me, I said. I've spent the last few years making myself. Then, softer, you could have chosen softer materials. She hung up. A minute later, a text arrived, ungrateful. Then, as if even she heard the thinness, take care. Then nothing for 3 days. During those days, press releases found their way to my inbox. Charity leadership transitions, event rebrandings, each with her name absent, then her title Emerita, then no mention at all. My aunt forwarded a group chat where cousins traded observations about how Aunt Margaret's finally getting what she gives. The thread was meaner than I liked, but also accurate, which is how meanness excused itself. I didn't reply. My father used to say, don't fix stories you aren't in. One afternoon, I drove into town to buy paint for the back steps. At the hardware store, a clerk with a name tag that said Joel asked, You Mr. Carter's kid? I nodded. He wiped his hands on his apron and smiled to one side. He used to argue with me about caulk, he said the tube lies about how much is left. Joel rang up my purchase, added a contractor discount neither of us mentioned, then leaned in. Saw the video, he said. Not unkindly. Look like a clean cut. Hurts less later when you don't saw back and forth. That evening, the lake threw back gold in slices. Evelyn sat on the steps with a tin of screws, organizing them by size because order relaxes some people. How's your mother? She asked. The question light enough to float. Rewriting, I said. Into what? A version where she gave us the house. Evelyn considered. Stories like that have a short shelf life. They spoil when exposed to air. We ate peaches over the sink because the juice ran liberatingly down our wrists. I told her about Joel and the caulk. She told me about a loose hinge on the bathroom cabinet that asks for patience, not strength. We watched a heron make a slow decision about landing.
Every choice has a posture.
The collapse wasn't just external. In the quieter hours, I felt smaller structures give way inside me. The need to anticipate, the flinch before a laugh as if it might be at me, the instinct to narrate my gestures as if a jury required explanation. I'd reach for my phone to prove I'd answered some message, then remember no one was grading me. I'd polish a sentence in my head for an argument I wouldn't hold. The echoes came, but like waves hitting rock, they spent themselves against something steadier. On the 9th day, my mother arrived unannounced. No heels this time. Flats. No lacquered smile. Bare face. Beautiful in a way I'd forgotten faces can be when they aren't performing. She stood at the edge of the porch steps, as if asking permission without knowing how to ask. "May I?" she said. Evelyn, who had a gift for triage, brought out 3 chairs, one for my mother, one for me, one for the part of the conversation none of us could carry. We sat. My mother looked at the lake the way you regard a word you've said wrong all your life and are only now hearing pronounced correctly. "I've been cold," she said. The pause was surgical. "I thought if I softened, I'd disappear." "You could try melting," I said, surprising myself. "Not cruelty, chemistry." She didn't bristle. She nodded. "Slow. I don't know how." Then, and here was the tremor, the slip. "Teach me." Evelyn reached for nothing. She said, "Teaching takes years." She said, neutral as weather. "Start with not grading." My mother's mouth tilted, Payne's cousin to a smile. "I don't knit," she said, as if naming a failure from a different century. "Neither do I said. "We can fail at new things too." She looked at me then. Not as an audience, not as an adversary, but as a person whose sentence she couldn't finish for once. "I'm sorry," she said. 2 words that in a lifetime of speeches, she had never auditioned. The apology didn't fix anything. It didn't even reach everything, but it landed where it could, and the ground there did not reject it. We sat a long time, letting the lake translate. A breeze edited the heat. Somewhere across the water, someone played a radio softly, a song from my father's decade that had forgiven its own corniness. A dragonfly attempted the impossible, staying still. Finally, my mother stood. "She won't fight you for it," she said, looking at the house as if it had introduced itself. "I don't want a house that refuses to be a mirror." "You could visit," I ventured, surprised at myself. "When we're here?" "If I don't turn visits into inspections," she said. "If we don't turn inspections into indictments," I returned. She nodded. "I'll bring pie," she offered, awkward as a child telling a joke. "Store-bought is fine," I said. "We're not grading." She left with smaller footsteps than I'd ever heard her make. When the gravel settled, Evelyn exhaled. "Scaffolding," she said. "What?" "She took down a little," Evelyn replied. "Just a plank or 2, enough to let air through." We went back inside. The evening took its time. I fixed the cabinet hinge that asked for patience. Evelyn labeled coffee tins because future us would forget which was decaf. The porch light flicked on at its own pace. Somewhere under the floorboards, the house adjusted itself, wood answering the day's weight. Things that are built to hold learn you by degrees. The collapse continued elsewhere, surely. My mother's calendar featuring wider spaces, her mirror less certain about who it was for. Rooms that had always applauded, now clearing their throats. But here, on this small piece of earth, another structure rose. Not grand, not symmetrical, not meant for brochures. A shelter with windows that stuck sometimes, a dock that spoke in groans, a kitchen where we let peaches drip. And in that shelter, I learned to stop rehearsing how to be loved and started practicing how to live.
Freedom doesn't arrive like a parade. It doesn't march in with banners and trumpets announcing you've finally broken the chains. It seeps in slowly, like light through blinds on a morning you expected to be dark. At first, you don't notice it. You're too used to looking for the shadows. But then, one day, you exhale and realize the air doesn't burn on the way out. That's when you know you're free. In the weeks after the party, the lakehouse became more than property. It became a sanctuary. Evelyn and I spent weekends patching leaks, sanding rails, and clearing brush from the edge of the dock. Work that might have felt like drudgery anywhere else felt here like restoration, not just of the house, but of something inside me.
The smell of sawdust mixed with pine, the creak of boards under my boots, the rhythmic scrape of paintbrushes. Each was a small exorcism of years spent bowing to impossible standards. I began to notice the small things I had ignored for years. How the kitchen window caught the morning sun just so, casting stripes across the counter. How the wind whispered through the trees at night, sounding like someone humming a lullaby, too soft for words. How Evelyn carried warmth in her silences, offering presence without pressure. My mother's voice, sharp, demanding, dismissive, grew fainter in my head. Not gone, not yet, but softer, like echoes finally running out of canyon walls to bounce from.
People kept talking, of course. The clip of the party still drifted from phone to phone, gathering comments, interpretations, exaggerations. Some painted me as cruel, as a child exacting revenge too publicly. Others called me brave, finally breaking the cycle. For the first time, I realized their opinions didn't matter. Freedom wasn't proving them wrong, it was not needing to. My mother called less often. When she did, her voice carried edges dulled by exhaustion. She tried apologies, halting and uneven, as though the words were tools she'd never learned how to use. I didn't mean, I was under pressure. None of them were perfect, and none of them undid the years behind us. But I no longer needed them to. One evening, as Evelyn and I sat on the porch watching the lake turn from blue to silver, my phone buzzed. My mother's name lit up the screen. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. I saw the pictures, she said, without introduction, of the repairs, of you there. Yes, I replied. You look happy, she said, and the words sounded foreign on her tongue. I am, I admitted. A pause stretched long enough for me to wonder if she'd hang up. Then, softer, that's good. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't redemption, but it was, for once, not criticism. And that was enough. As the weeks slipped into months, the lake house began to feel like it was breathing again. Friends visited, neighbors dropped off jars of honey, fresh bread, baskets of apples. Evelyn hosted dinners where laughter spilled louder than the clink of silverware, where no one measured affection in the size of gifts, but in the ease of presence. And me, I learned to let go of rehearsals. I didn't need to practice conversations in my head. Didn't need to steel myself for insults that might come. For the first time, my life wasn't an exam. One morning, I walked down to the dock alone. The air was cool, the water still. I sat at the edge, my feet dangling above the reflection of the sky. I thought about my father, his steady voice, his quiet warnings, his unshakable belief that love was about belonging, not ownership. I thought about Evelyn, the way she had received the gift, not as a trophy, but as trust. And I thought about my mother, still somewhere in the city, still likely rewriting stories in her head. And I realized something. Revenge wasn't the point. Freedom was. The velvet box hadn't destroyed her. It had revealed her. In tossing it aside, she showed the world what I had always known, that her hunger was endless, her love conditional, her approval a mirage. But in giving it to Evelyn, I had shown myself something too, that I didn't have to chase love anymore. I could choose it. I could place it where it belonged. As the sun rose higher, the water shimmered, and I whispered to the lake, "Thank you." It wasn't to my father or to Evelyn or even to myself. It was to everything. The pain, the humiliation, the long years of doubt that had brought me here. Because without them, I might never have learned the truth. Sometimes revenge isn't fire. It isn't fury. It isn't shouting someone down until your voice breaks. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's timing. Sometimes it's walking away lighter because you finally put down what was never yours to carry. I stood, stretched, and looked back at the house. Its windows glinted in the sunlight. Its porch sagged in familiar welcome. Its walls held stories old and new. It wasn't perfect, neither was I, but it was home. And for the first time in my life, I was free. Sometimes revenge doesn't need shouting, fighting, or anger. It needs silence, timing, and truth. By giving the lake house to love instead of greed, I honored my father,
freed myself, and let my mother destroy herself with her own choices. That's the kind of justice you never forget.